As I mentioned at the beginning of the service, today is one of the 2 days a year where we as Grace Church have the tradition of devoting our worship to prayers for healing. And I think that it's no accident that those 2 days are this day, the last Sunday before we enter into the season of Lent, and also the last Sunday before we enter into the season of Advent. Our children would tell us those are the purple seasons, and purple is for preparation. And so it makes so much sense to me that as we step across the thresholds into these holy seasons of deepening, that we devote ourselves to prayers for God's healing. It's an interesting kind of happenstance then that the liturgical celebration that falls on this day is always that gospel reading that we heard, and we have a window of it in the back, so I commend that to you as another form of absorbing the scripture. So it's in your right side, the back right corner there is our window of the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration, and we hear it echoed with Moses going up the mountaintop in the First Testament scripture. And they're stories about a numinous encounter with God, incredibly mysterious, luminous experiences that sort of go beyond our possibility to comprehend. And in fact, they might seem so beyond our possibility to comprehend that they really would seem to have little or nothing to do with us here on the ground in everyday life. And I'm also left wondering, what do these experiences of those holy ones on the mountaintop have to do with our prayers, our earnest and needed prayers for healing? So what I'm going to give you permission to let your mind wander during the rest of the homily, and I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but I'd like you for a few minutes to try to set your mind free to go and retrieve a memory of what for you was actually a mountaintop experience, of a time in your life when you felt incredibly close to God. For me, it happens a lot of times on mountaintops, but it doesn't have to be, right? Sometimes it just is the sun coming through the window and it startles us into the recognition of God's presence. So set one part of your mind free to sort of wander and find that memory. And I'm going to share with you a couple of things about today's scripture as we do that. We're multitasking here. One is, two things that resonate with me and two things that surprise me about today's scripture reading in terms of my own experience of those numinous holy moments. One is, like Peter, I always want to stay there. I always want to say, hey, let's hang out. This is great. We'll build a house. I'm never coming back from retreat. This is wonderful. And Jesus always, touches me on the shoulder, just like he does the disciples at the end, and says, get up, do not be afraid. It's time to head down the mountain. And the second one is that it can be hard to understand these experiences at the time. Very often it's not until later that we understand them. And I think that's why Jesus tells them, don't worry about telling anybody about this now. This isn't really yours to interpret. This is yours to have experienced and to hold for the moment until after he's raised from the dead. So those are two things that feel a little bit familiar to me about that experience of the Transfiguration and my own mountaintop experiences. Two things that feel a little different to me about that are that something that strikes me about the Transfiguration is that it wasn't just one person up there alone with God. I mean, I tend to think of this as Jesus' numinous experience, and everybody else got let in on it. But it wasn't just Jesus up on the mountaintop. It wasn't just Moses, but it wasn't just Jesus, right? It was Jesus, and Peter, and James, and John, and it was Jesus, and Moses, and Elijah. So you have there the whole communion of saints. You have a whole community around this experience of the closeness of God to Jesus. I wonder what that has to tell me this Lenten season. And the second thing that stands out to me is that, God has a message here. It's not just all kind of, light and sort of clouds and, there's a great big show going on. And I think it can kind of distract us from the message, which is very, very simple. God says again, just like God did at the baptism, "This is my beloved child with whom I am well pleased." But then God tacks on 3 little words, right? Listen to him. Listen to him. We're taking the theme of dreaming this year and this Lenten season as a way to kind of wake up our hearts and play with listening. Right? Listening to God in our own actual dreams, listening to God in the aspirations of our hearts, listening to God in the dreams of this world, particularly of the most marginalized, and listening to God in the dreams of this community. I wonder what listening, what those moments of God drawing close to us, of having the veil between the spiritual realm and our own physical ability to perceive drawn aside for a moment so that we can enter into God's presence. And healing have to do with each other. So I'd like to ask you now to close your eyes, and if something has kind of come to you in terms of an experience in your life, a moment in your life when you felt the closest to God, when you felt like you were drawn into God's nearer presence, I'd like to ask you to be present to that memory and experience. And if nothing's come to you yet, just keep your mind and your heart open for this time. I invite you to enter into that memory. Think about the physical location where you were at the time. Remember who was around you, what time of day it was, what the temperature was like, what the light was like. Maybe there was a particular smell that your memory holds on to from that experience, or a physical sensation. What were you doing with your body? You standing, kneeling, sitting, lying down, walking. And as you've recalled the physical surroundings and the physical sensations, I invite you now to recall the inner experience. What was it like for your soul, for your heart, for your mind, to be in the nearer presence of God? To know that God was there with you, to experience some aspect of God's glory. Be with that for a moment. Take a breath, consciously a deep breath or two. Let them out. When you're ready, come back to this moment. They always say to wiggle your fingers and your toes. I think that works. So you become present to your body, your mind, your soul, and your spirit in this place. God is with us, here and now. God is inviting us into God's arms. God's asking us to let God heal us. And God's asking us to listen. You'll see the intercessors and I go up to the altar rail in just a moment and prepare ourselves for this time of prayers for healing. And after the altar rail closes, anyone at any moment who feels moved is welcome to come up to the altar rail for prayers, which of course remain only between you and that intercessor and God. And but for all of us, those who come forward, those who stay seated, those who are at home, we are in this sacred space of God's near presence. So I invite you to dwell there, to let God hold you and heal you, to listen. All are welcome. All are invited. Won't you come? Intercessors, please come forward.